Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we unravel the story of the assassination that changed the world. On a summer morning in 1914, a teenage revolutionary fired 2 shots on a Sarajevo street and set the world on fire. Who was his target, Franz Ferdinand? Why did a group of young men risk everything to kill him? And how did a single wrong turn trigger a global catastrophe? Well, hello Dan, pleased to be joining you as always on the podcast for an episode that we've actually discussed doing a number of times, and by coincidence, by accident, so this was one of our not winning votes on choose an episode poll over on the Dugout, but we love the subject so much, and the fact that we would be recording it close to the anniversary of the events taking place, that we thought it was a great chance to visit it right now. And this is, of course, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And it's a subject that I'd be first to admit it's not one I know especially well, but it's one that I've really enjoyed researching in the advance to this episode because it's a story that is almost beyond belief, Dan.
Hi, Spence. Yeah, it is. It's beyond belief, I think, in a number of different ways as we kind of work through the intricacies of the actual event, which, of course, is very different to the grander strategic elements associated to it. And of course, the politics too. But in terms of the actual event, the assassination itself, I was saying to you just before we start recording, it's a little bit of a comedy of errors, minus a bit of the comedy, of course, because there's some pretty serious outcomes. But there's some pretty horrific mistakes made. There's a fair few blunders, and a few of those moments that combine that quite often we see in those big disasters from throughout history. You know, the Titanic sinking, the disaster at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where you get this kind of, if you like, a perfect storm of strange coincidences that leads to a real key moment in history. And I would say this fits absolutely into that bill. As we go through the story, hopefully that'll become clear. But it is a really interesting one. And I think to understand it, Spence, we need to understand a little bit about European politics really at the turn of the century and what's going on with these kind of 2 superpowers that have evolved, and more specifically in the sort of Balkan region generally. So what can you tell us about that? I know I've thrown you under the bus there, maybe.
Well, this could be not just an episode, it could be a series of episodes discussing the political build-up to the war. But I'll try and keep this fairly brief. And the story really of European politics from really around about 1900 up to 1914 is one of really simmering tensions. And in some ways, those simmering tensions are mirrored by the climate at the time, because this is the era of the Edwardian summers, this period of very, very warm summers, especially in Western Europe, in fact, that linger long in the memory, even after the First World War has, of course, filled the scene. And within the wider context of Europe, at heart, there is a tension between Germany and its ally, Austro-Hungary, with looser powers associated with it, particularly the Ottoman Empire is loosely associated with Germany, Bulgaria loosely associated with Germany. But you have Germany and Austro-Hungary, the central powers, allied with Italy, funnily enough, although this is a defensive alliance, and of course it won't lead to Italy joining Germany in the war. You have this central grouping, and they're facing off against the Entente, which is France and Russia in close alliance, and Britain, which has an understanding, a friendly understanding, the Entente with France, and an agreement with Russia, but is not allied with them. And so you have these power blocks, Britain, France, and Russia on one side, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and maybe Italy on the other. And there have been tensions between them throughout this period. Germany is operating a very erratic foreign policy at this time, and driven by a combination of paranoia that Germany fears being encircled by its enemies, driven by the fact that German decision-making is erratic. The Kaiser and his court are erratic. They are an unpredictable element. And driven by the fact that German foreign policy is anchored on this idea that grows and grows and grows in the summer of, the pre-war period, that the only way to really resolve this is to strike a massive blow, a military blow, against its encircling enemies. At the same time, you have Austro-Hungary, which is an empire in decline. It's complex, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic. Its power base has been in decline since it was defeated in the 1866 war by Prussia. And it is engaged in a rivalry primarily in the Balkans against Russia. The Balkans, of course, for a long time, part of the Ottoman Empire, for centuries, in fact, but a series of revolutions and a series of wars have actually seen the Balkans gain their independence. But just as they gained their independence from the Ottomans, the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians see this not as a thing to celebrate, new nations appearing, instead as an opportunity to step in where the Ottomans have left. And there is this great tension between Austro-Hungary and Russia about who will dominate the Balkans now that the Ottomans have retreated. And at the same time, of course, the Balkan nations, small, unpredictable, all universally quite poor, universally very nationalist. I say universally, but for the most part, quite nationalist, quite fiercely nationalist. They don't want to be absorbed into an empire. They've just seen themselves exit the Ottoman Empire. They don't want to change one empire for the other. And so there's all these simmering tensions. Germany is looking for an opportunity to strike and settle the question once and for all. Austro-Hungary and Russia are squabbling over who will dominate the Balkan regions. France, of course, is anticipating a war with Germany and thinks it's going to come sooner or later. And in all this, you have a lot of very combustible and unpredictable elements. And the Balkans had been a sore spot in European politics for decades. Bismarck famously quoted that the Balkans were not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. A number of political statesmen had noted prior to 1914, if a war was going to break out, it would probably be sparked down in the Balkans, where you had empires interacting with each other with these small, independent and fiercely independent states. And so this is a period of tension. Everybody is looking at each other warily. There are deep-seated issues of power and balance of power that have not been resolved. There are ambitions that are felt can only be satisfied through war, not just in Germany, but in Austro-Hungary as well. The route that many crumbling nations or empires go to is to fight a war to unify the empire. The Austro-Hungarians are thinking of this as well. And so all these tensions are in play in the summer of 1914, and it's against this background of a Balkans that is newly independent, fiercely independent, and quite strikingly nationalistic, facing encroaching imperial expansion from Austro-Hungary, that Archduke Franz Ferdinand is going to make his fateful trip. And I've laid out the big picture here, Dan, but perhaps we could start to look at the characters in this story, because Franz Ferdinand, aside from being a British band of about 20 years ago, a familiar name to anybody interested in the First World War. But can you tell us a bit about who is he? Why is he important? And why is he going to Sarajevo in 1914?
Absolutely. I think some important kind of questions to cover there. I mean, the first thing is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, an Archduke, so not the empire ruler, but he is an Austro-Hungarian. In fact, he's the heir presumptive to the Empire of Austria-Hungary. His father is on the throne at the time, and he is next in line to take up the mantle and kind of continue to hopefully run the empire. And of course, the Balkans is a very big area. Austria-Hungary's been throwing its weight around, forcing Serbia to yield to its interests in Bosnia, as you've rightly said, which puts a situation, really, it adds more to the tensions. The ironic thing is, Franz Ferdinand, who is actually married to Sophie Hotek, who is of German descent, he is actually fairly conservative. If he takes power, following his father, there's a very good chance that actually it's going to work out positively for those independentists within Bosnia-Herzegovina, as it is at the time, and also for those people even in Serbia, because he's quite conservative in his views. Chances are he's going to be an improvement for the people on the ground, actually, in that part of the world. The irony about that is, of course, it's going to be his death which is going to, of course, be the proverbial spark that lights the powder keg. But the powder keg itself, as you've well laid out, Spence, is absolutely in the Balkans at this time. And Franz Ferdinand, if you were gonna go anywhere as an Austro-Hungarian heir to an empire on a wedding anniversary tour in 1914, if somebody had said to the Archduke, "Where would you like to go?" his choice of Sarajevo is probably at the bottom of everybody's list. except his apparently, because that's exactly what he and his wife decide to do. They're going to go on a tour of this newly annexed area. They're going to be in an area where really tensions are absolutely inflamed. And of course, there are a lot of people on the ground who are, as you rightly say, absolutely hating of being under the jackboot of yet another empire. And key amongst those is a group which goes by the name of Mlada Bosna, which translates to Young Serbia. This is a group of revolutionaries who are wanting independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they're willing to put their lives on the line in order to achieve it. It's a young kind of idealistic group. They're not particularly well organized. They've got some really powerful beliefs, and a group of 6 or 7, in fact, of them are going to form a key plot, which is going to eventually collide with Franz Ferdinand and his trip to Sarajevo. I'm just going to run off a few of those names because it's quite fun to try and say them, and I'm sure I'll make a mess of them. But perhaps the most famous of them, and actually involved in the plotting from the very start, is a young man by the name of Gavrilo Princip. He is, again, one of these young, late teenage idealists who's absolutely desperate to see his nation freed and independent, and totally does not want the Austro-Hungarians involved at all. He's joined by a man by the name of Nedeljko Kabrinovic, another called Trifko Grabish, Mohamed Mehmed Basic, Svetko Popovic, Vaso Kubrilovic, and they are led by a man by the name of Danilo Ilic, who is effectively going to be the guy that orchestrates this attack. So these guys come up with a plan. They realize the heir presumptive of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is coming to their city amongst these tensions, and they see an opportunity. They say, we're going to do something about it. But the problem is, they can't really do a lot about it because they haven't got any equipment, they haven't got any arms, they haven't got any kind of backing that you would need in order to put a big, powerful assassination plot together and carry it out successfully. Fortunately for them, Serbia, not too far away, also has a few societies, and they're quite willing to allow these young idealists to apply more pressure and potentially kill somebody like Franz Ferdinand. And it comes in the form of the Black Hand Gang, which is a kind of quasi-military, secretive society in Serbia who do have access to weapons, who do have access to money, who have got access to explosives, and are willing to back these guys from young Bosnia. So we get this kind of relatively uncomfortable alliance, but needs must, and the Black Hand are going to start supporting and actually filtering weapons and explosives to the young Bosnians and get them in a position where, when on the 28th of June 1914, Franz Ferdinand is going to come to Sarajevo, there is an opportunity to make an attempt on his life. It's worth pointing out, Spence, though, assassinations, this sounds like a really shocking thing, assassinating the leader of an empire in Europe in the 1900s. That's pretty shocking stuff. It's actually not that rare.
No, it's not. I think something that is really easily forgotten in the 21st century. We look back and we see the glitz and the glamour, the last days, really, of these spectacular and centuries-old European monarchies, and it looks, with their pageantry and their parades and so forth, it looks as if they are untouchable. We forget how common in the 19th century and into the early 20th century either attempts on the lives of royal members of the royal family or successful assassinations of the members of the royal family actually were. This was not something that was completely unknown. It was something, of course, everybody wanted to avoid, but whether it was from nationalist movements such as the assassins here, whether it's from anarchists who were simply anti-everything and thought that their first step to their dream world of anarchy was to assassinate the heads of state. Attempts on the lives, some of them successful, against European monarchs were really, really quite common. The Serbian royal family had suffered an assassination from the Black Hand, of course, earlier in this period. The monarchy in Portugal was attacked. There were attempts on the lives of Queen Victoria in the 19th century as well. So assassinating a prominent member of the royal family was actually considered a constant risk in many respects. And what is important to remember is assassinating these weren't abstract figures. This is not an era of constitutional monarchy. If the member of the British royal family was assassinated now, it would be massive global news. But in the pre-First World War period, these are monarchs that, for the most part, actually have a significant influence on government. In some cases, they have major powers. I'm thinking of Kaiser Wilhelm, for example. He is a decision maker. And so assassinating these figures was striking a blow against the very essence of Austro Hungary. And it's worth just sort of saying a little bit about, well, why do these groups, the Black Hand and Young Bosnia, coincide over this? Well, it's because to assassinate a major member of the Austro-Hungarian royal family, the heir presumptive, in fact, it is saying, you will not rule here. You will not rule in Sarajevo. We can reach out and strike you. And you may think, well, what's Serbia's sort of role in all this? And this is the sort of the complexity of Balkan politics at the time. Serbia's independent. It's been fighting in the Balkan Wars. It's got a very fiercely nationalistic outlook. They've achieved their independence from the Ottomans. They absolutely do not want anybody to then take over their empire. And they see the Bosnian Assassins, the Young Bosnia movement, as, I think, a useful ally. These are people who are willing to do something, and also useful patsers. Because if the plot goes horribly wrong and everybody gets arrested and put on trial, Serbia has a degree of deniability in this. And the Black Hand itself is a really peculiar organization. It's a secret military group. It's been founded in 1911 by Serbian army officers, many of whom were veterans of the 1903 coup that had overthrown the Serbian king and murdered him viciously and brutally in 1903. And the Black Hand's longer-term political ambition was to actually expand Serbia and create a unified South Slavic nation, bringing them all together. And indeed, the Black Hand slogan, their motto was unification or death. They weren't therefore just a protector of Serbia in their own minds. They were also an expansionist group. So ironically, you have Austro-Hungary trying to expand its borders south, and you have the Black Hand envisaging Serbia expanding its borders north and east and growing its strength here instead. And they were a pretty ferocious group with the head of the Serbian military intelligence, with the codename Apis, who is the leader. Apis, an Egyptian god. He had that nickname because of his tremendous presence, and he was deeply connected to the Serbian military elite. Serbia is almost a military dictatorship at this time. It's complex, but almost a military dictatorship. And so, destabilizing Austro-Hungary benefits Serbia. And they can do this by supporting these underground nationalist groups. And crucially, you mentioned earlier, Dan, these would-be assassins, they're young, they're naive, they're not equipped, they don't have access to military equipment. Well, the Black Hand can provide some equipment there. They're the ones who can smuggle some weapons to these assassins, to Young Bosnia, which has similar views. The Young Bosnia has a view of a unified Slavic nation. And Serbia can use them and has deniability here. If you send a whole bunch of Serbian military assassins and they get caught, well, that's a serious problem for Serbia. But if you equip and arm some Bosnian assassins, there's a degree of deniability there. So it's an incredibly risky game, it has to be said. It's incredibly risky. If this backfires on Serbia, wow, there's going to be consequences. But at the same time, it's them who are able to supply weapons, a degree of marksmanship training, and also some cyanide pills to the assassins. So this is a complex conspiracy. But at the same time, we keep coming back to this. You look at the assassins who've been recruited. Gavrilo Princip's the perfect example. He's educated, he's intelligent, and he's educated. Comes from a very peasant background, but he's been educated, actually in the Austro-Hungarian-sponsored schools. But he's slight, he's ill with tuberculosis, as a number of the conspirators are, but he has this revolutionary fervor. He wants to strike a blow against Austro-Hungary. He just doesn't know how. And into this, you suddenly have the Black Hand who are willing to provide weapons and some equipment, some instruction. It's not a very promising setup for an assassination, though, Dan.
Well, there are a couple of things to mention here, but it's got to be said, Franz Ferdinand and his security team in particular don't do themselves any favours. So whilst you've got these 6 young assassins with Danilo Ilic really orchestrating the entire thing at the same time, these 6 young guys are given a bomb each, they're given a pistol each, and as you say, they're given cyanide tablets. They're going to be dotted along a route that they know that Archduke Franz Ferdinand is going to be travelling on the 28th of June. The reason they know that is the Archduke has publicised his visit and published the route, the exact route that the vehicles in this motorcade of 6 vehicles are going to be taken on that day. Now, in terms of security for somebody in what's clearly known as being an unstable location, there's some suggestion that actually this visit is meant to show security and stability in the region. I don't buy that one myself. I think there's just too much going on there. But effectively, what's going to happen is Franz Ferdinand is going to arrive by train into Sarajevo on the morning of the 28th of June. He is going to be in the third of a 6-vehicle convoy that's then going to travel at slow speed throughout the city along a published route. He and his wife, by the way, in an open-top vehicle, going to be very conspicuous. They're going to make their way to the town hall, take part in a few official ceremonies, and then do a kind of slow parade route back and then disappear out of the city. Into this, 6 assassins have filtered into the waiting crowds, and they've picked strategic points along that pre-published route. The intention being that ideally, one of those 6 is going to succeed, either by throwing a bomb which blows up in the Archduke's vehicle, by shooting them, and of course they have their suicide pills afterwards to make sure they're not captured alive. Despite, as you rightly say, Spence, 3 of them are actually not far from death's door with tuberculosis consumption at the time. And that maybe adds something more to that kind of fervor that they've got. You know, they know that their time span is limited. But we have these 6 guys, as we say, that line up. And really, you've got this perfect storm set up for when the Archduke is going to begin his journey. I don't know. I mean, what's your thoughts on this, Spence, from that point of view? Do you think the Archduke, in even coming to Sarajevo in the first place, is taking a totally unnecessary risk? Or do you think there's a larger political point to be made of somebody going to a hotbed like that and showing really no fear?
I suppose with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, we can say this is a reckless and unnecessary move. But I think it speaks a little bit to Franz Ferdinand himself, because he's a complex character. And he's the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He will become the emperor. But at the same time, he's actually fallen in love with, as you mentioned, Countess Sophie Schotek, who is not politically acceptable as a wife to the Habsburg dynasty. And that means his children, or their children, will not inherit. And Sophie is actually treated quite badly in the context of courtly society. She's excluded from a lot of formal functions. And ironically, Sarajevo is one of the few places where Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife are allowed to appear together officially and publicly. And I think that gives the assassination a little degree of emotional resonance as well. And one of the strange things about Franz Ferdinand is he's a complex character. He's very religious. He's extremely hierarchical. So he doesn't really complain about the fact that his children can no longer inherit. It's just part of the courtly game of Habsburg society at the time. But he's also got some quite what we would consider modern or quite liberal views for the day. So he's a reformist about the empire. He believes in federalization. So rather than it being a very top-down empire, instead allow individual nationalities and ethnicities to have a little bit more say in how they're run. And he's, by that extension, he's in favour of extending more rights to the Slavic peoples, which the empire is expanding in. And we'll never know, because he's killed, he cannot tell us. But one wonders about his decision to visit. One, does he just want the opportunity to appear with his wife, who he loves very, very deeply? He's intensely committed to his wife. Does he see this as an opportunity to perhaps advance these ideas he has? And remember, this isn't just a fringe royal. This is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, appearing in Sarajevo and trying to say, I'm in favour of more rights for Slavic peoples and so forth. Is this a statement for his future political outlook and so on? And yet at the same time, given what we said earlier on, that being assassinated is a permanent risk for members of royal families in Europe in the pre-First World War period, and you're going to a city which has definitely a complex relationship with Austro-Hungary, it is risky. It is a deeply risky move. And given what, of course, it leads to, it's impossible not to think, couldn't you have gone somewhere else? Surely there's a better place you could have done an official state visit. But there's reasons perhaps why, and we can only speculate because the Archduke doesn't live long enough to tell us. But there are reasons why he'd choose to go here on that day.
And that brings us to that day, because it's at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 28th of June that motorcade is going to start its journey. It's starting from the main train station in Sarajevo, making its way towards the town hall. As we said before, there are 6 assassins along the route that have got an open top vehicle traveling very slowly to aim at with either a bomb or a pistol, chances are somebody's going to have a go here. But incredibly, the very first two assassins who are standing side by side in the middle of the road have a great opportunity, both of them presumably through inexperience and also a huge amount of nerves. It's the first two actually is Mehmed Basic and Kubrilovic, the two that are literally standing there watching. Mehmed Basic takes the bomb out of his pocket that he's got armed and ready to go, aiming to throw it into the vehicle, and he just freezes. Can't do it. For whatever reason, he bottles it, for lack of a better phrase, and he infects the guy next to him with the same thing. And both of the two men, these guys that are planned for weeks and months to exactly this moment, who've got themselves within throwing distance of that slow-moving vehicle with a bomb in their hand and a pistol alongside them, both of them stand still and watch this car go by. A silent failure. Nobody realizes that the motorcade has already passed the first two men. So frustration immediately. They just can't do it, and I guess something just freezes in them, and that allows the motorcade to pass on. But it doesn't get very far. It actually gets a little bit further down to a bridge where the third assassin is waiting. Now he's got a little more courage, and he decides that he's going to make his move. In fact, he's already armed his bomb, Nedeljko Kabrinovic. He throws it at the Archduke's vehicle. And it's a very close thing, Spence. It's not far away from landing inside, but doesn't quite pan out that way.
No, it doesn't. It's so he's the first one to actually gird his loins and do it. And just before we get onto the bomb, it's worth saying, I think this emphasizes that these are not hardened assassins. These are not hardened killers in the way that some of the prominent members of the Black Hand are. These are young men. They're basically sort of filled with revolutionary fervor. They're students and so forth, but it's one thing to talk boldly and over a bottle of wine about how you're going to do this and do that. When you actually have to do it, it's not easy. And these men are not trained assassins at all. So this is why the first opportunities are missed. But then that the bomb is thrown at the Archduke's car at about 10 in the morning, and it misses. It bounces off the folded down convertible roof, because the roof is folded so that the crowds, and there are big crowds here, can see the Archduke and Sophie. It hits the convertible roof, it bounces off, and it explodes under the next car. It injures a number of people in that car, incidentally. And Sophie, of course, is greatly shaken. There's been an attempt on her life. Apparently, Franz Ferdinand has some dust and some bits of metal, small pieces land on his uniform, and he's furious that there's been an attempt on his life, but he makes a big show of brushing off this dust and this bit of wreckage. I'm not fazed. He's showing this very, very cool and calm and collected view, and he insists on continuing his visit. And there's reasons for this. One, he as we've mentioned, it's not unusual for there to be attempts to assassinate royal family members. And secondly, I think he wants to show that he is not afraid of a handful of fanatics and rabble-rousers and so on. And I also think that he's aware that the vast majority of people in the crowd are actually pleased to see him. He's getting a good reception. And the fact that most people are pleased to see him, I think, is actually reflecting what happens to this would-be assassin, because he has a pretty horrible 5 minutes, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, this whole kind of sequence up until now, if this was the end of that state visit, you'd look at this and say, what a disaster this was for the assassins. First two guys are frozen. Third guy misses his target. As a result of which, by the way, was Franz Ferdinand isn't outwardly at least phased. His driver certainly is, and his driver buries his foot into the floor, and they fly off down the road, and they actually drive directly past the waiting three final assassins, who the car's going too quick. They just can't get near to kind of blow up, to make another attempt. So all six assassins have been bypassed at this point. And that third guy, the guy who actually throws the bomb, which is Kabrinovic, he takes this poison. He's been given this cyanide pill, takes it, and clearly he's going to die. He's in a bad situation. People are starting to look around. They've seen him throw this bomb. The crowds are outraged. And then he jumps off a nearby bridge into a river, an attempt to make absolutely doubly sure that he's going to end his life. Unfortunately for him, two things happen. One, the water in the river is ankle deep, and all he does is smash his ankles up. Secondly, the cyanide pill fails, and all it does, he vomits his guts up. To make matters worse, The crowd, who are really quite unhappy about it, drag him out of the river and give him the beating of his life for about the next 5 minutes. So this guy gets the hell kicked out of him, just throwing his guts up, busted ankles, and it's an absolute abject failure at this point. Princip, the other remaining guys, Illich, they're all thinking, "Oh my, how have we made such a mess of this possibility?" And at that point, the Archduke, outraged and his wife very shaken, arrive at the town hall and into safety.
They do, and the fate of the would-be assassin, I think it says something about how seriously the Black Hand have treated this assassination attempt. Because apparently the reason the cyanide pill fails is it's out of date. It's years out of date, and so all it does is produce extreme vomiting. As you say, Dan, he's jumped into a river that's very shallow because of the heat wave, smashed his ankles, and then he's dragged out and beaten violently by the crowd. And the fact that the crowd beats this man violently, it says something about the mood here, that these assassins are by no means capturing a public mood within this parade. The parade is actually being greeted with cheers and a sort of cheerful reaction. And so somebody tries to assassinate Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, and they don't commit suicide. They're in for a bad time, and so it happens. But that bomb has done, as what you mentioned, of course, it's frightened Franz Ferdinand's driver. It's also wounded, of course, men in the following car. And this is going to lead to this tragic change of events, because around about 10:45, Franz Ferdinand completes his official tour without any further incident. The other assassins are demoralised and dispirited and feeling the enormity of what's happening, and it's too much for them. But Franz Ferdinand then insists that he wants to go and visit the wounded as well, the people who've been injured in this failed assassination attempt. And that's going to change the route that he's going to be taking instead. And it's a very noble thing. He wants to visit his wounded security and so forth, the wounded members of his motorcade. But if he'd gone home at the end of 10:45 a.m., then what is about to happen would never have happened, because it means that the Archduke is going to stay in Sarajevo a little longer than his official visit would allow. And it's through a sort of terrible series of events, it's going to bring him into contact with Gavrilo Princip.
It's such a fine balance of a thing as well, because the route that he's taken to the hospital is actually en route back to the train station. It's not the same as the remainder of the published route, but it's not far off it. In fact, they decide partly to take this route to the hospital because it keeps them on the main road and allows them to go at speed rather than winding through a few of the smaller roads, which are a little slower to navigate. In fact, Princip, despite being hugely dejected, goes and stands somewhere that he thinks, if the route continues published on the way back to the station, the Archduke might pass. It's actually only one road off. It's a right turn instead of going straight on. And he kind of stands on that corner, feeling pretty dejected about the whole situation. At the same time that the Archduke, with his driver, get back into their vehicle from the town hall and start making their way down the main road towards the hospital. Except, and this is where you get those strange moments of fate that happen here, nobody's told the driver that the route's changed. He's not been informed that actually the route back to the station is now going to go via the hospital. And that small little detail means that as he's traveling down the main road to head back, he all of a sudden, against most expectations, takes a right turn. As he takes that right turn, someone in the Duke's entourage calls out and says, no, you're going the wrong way. Stop. Turn it around, we're going to take the main road back instead. That exact location where he stops and then sticks the car in reverse, and amazingly, in that same instant, manages to stall it. Who's standing about 10 feet away? Gavrilo Princip.
And this is one of those moments where history is going to turn, because Princip, dejected, dispirited, unwell, probably waiting for his opportunity to go home, is suddenly presented with a staggering opportunity where a stalled car is about 10 feet away from him when he stood outside the cafe. Apparently given up at this stage, but at this moment, with this opportunity so blatant in front of him, he's not going to miss, neither metaphorically or physically. And he steps forward, pulls out his pistol, and he fires 2 shots at point-blank range. And Sophie's hit in the abdomen, fatally wounded. Franz Ferdinand is shot through the neck. Supposedly his last words, recorded by a witness in the car, is, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Possibly a little bit of a poetic moment, but we don't know. They were certainly deeply devoted to each other, but both are fatally wounded by these shots. And Princeps immediately, of course, grabbed by bystanders. He's beaten as well, wrestled to the ground and disarmed. But in just a split second, he's carried out his work. He's carried out his assassination. And by such chance, because if this series of incidents had not led Franz Ferdinand to that corner where Gavrilo was idling, then none of this would have happened. And so he is struck, he has carried out his assassination, and he's killed both Sophie and Franz Ferdinand. They are fatally, they're mortally wounded. And Princeps himself is absolutely unrepentant about it. Later, when he's on trial and he's asked about, he's confronted about why have you done it, he says at trial, "I am not a criminal, for I destroyed one who was evil. I am a patriot." In the aftermath of this, the crowd, I think, would disagree. He's given a pretty ferocious beating, as the other failed assassin is, and he's dragged away. Of course, he's arrested and so forth. But he has assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and from that point, of course, it's the touch paper has been lit, the fuse has been lit, and Europe is now on a very, very rapid countdown to this huge conflagration, which I hinted at earlier. All these tensions that have been simmering and bubbling and creating international tensions in the decade before the First World War. Though nobody really realised it at the time, because everybody across Europe is horrified by this assassination. There's widespread sympathy for Austro-Hungary, and there's a widespread expectation there will be some punishment meted out to whoever is found responsible for this. Nobody realises that within a month, Europe is going to be plummeting into an all-out war because of this assassination. And there's a number of factors that play into this, and one of the most important is, a few days after the assassination, on the 5th of July, there's a meeting between German and Austro-Hungarian governments, and Germany issues what's called the blank check. Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg tells Austria-Hungary must act quickly, and the German government will support her through thick and thin. And this is still one of the most debated moments in the build-up to the First World War. What did Germany mean by this? Was this really egging Austro-Hungary on to create this war where Germany thought it could finally crush its enemies? Was it just a strong expression of political support that the Austro-Hungarians then ran with? Well, there's hundreds of books, hundreds of thousands of words written on this, still debated. I actually am inclined to believe Germany wanted Austro-Hungary to go in and do something about this, to use it as a pretext for this European showdown that Germany had been dreaming about really for years prior to this point. But with that German backing, Austro-Hungary now has the confidence and the military mettle to really push a hard line onto Serbia, and a 10-point ultimatum is issued to Serbia on the 23rd of July with just 48 hours to respond, which is really, really short in the context of 1914. And Serbia actually accepts 8 of the points of this 10, but 2 it has to deny are that Austrian officials will be involved in the investigation, and also Austria will have a role in suppressing Serb nationalism and subversive elements within Serbia. Well, that's basically giving up your sovereignty and saying this expansionist empire is allowed to put officials in your country and dictate your policy. And that is just not, it's not politically possible in Serbia at the time. And Serbia's response is actually incredibly conciliatory by the standards of early 20th century diplomacy. And British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey remarked, "It's the most conciliatory reply ever made by one state to another." Serbia bends over backwards to try and meet all this, partially because it knows it is heavily implicated in this. And at this stage, it's clear that the line traces back to Serbia. It's not clear just how much it traces back to Serbia, and the Serbian government knows this is going to blow up in our faces unless we bend over backwards here. But Austro-Hungary doesn't really want peace. It wants war. It wants to conquer Serbia and add it to the empire. The ultimatum is not meant to be accepted. seems to be a perfect opportunity to crush Serbia militarily, end Serbian influence in the Balkans, reassert dominance, show the Russians that Austro-Hungary is not a crumbling empire, it means business. And Austro-Hungary can do this because Germany has said, well, whatever you do, we'll back you. We'll protect, and Austro-Hungary interprets this as Germany will protect her from Russia as well. And so in the space of a month, from an assassination, which, as we've laid out, pretty incompetent, heavily dependent on luck, heavily dependent on chance occurrences, Europe is about to plummet into war. And as Lloyd George later wrote, at this point, at the end of July, the nations slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war without any trace of apprehension or dismay.
It's so powerful for me to think that on that one street corner in Sarajevo in the summer of 1914, that first domino fell, which led to, of course, over 10 million deaths, millions and millions of deaths, and tragedy, untold human cost. That all started to tick over just with that one action. And I do often wonder what someone like Princip would have done had they known what the outcome would have been. In fact, we do know, at least from one of those assassins, it was Svetko Popovic, who was actually sentenced only to 13 years. He's released in 1919 at the end of the war, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire is of course brought to an end. Later becomes the curator of Sarajevo Museum, and believe it or not, Spence, 50 years after, he attends the service to commemorate that event, the 50th anniversary. He's present there, one of the assassins, and he says there and then in front of the crowds, had I known that this would have led to war, I would have never have taken part in it. That's pretty powerful, actually, when you think about it. And yeah, I mean, you have to agree, surely. But what's interesting as well is those 7 guys in total, what happens to them? Because despite, the astronomical cost as a result of it, actually there's not a huge amount of really serious punishment, partly because the Austro-Hungarians, they will not execute people who are under the age of, I think, 20 at that time. And so Kabrinovic gets a 20-year sentence. Interestingly as well, is going to write to the Archduke's children whilst in prison and apologize specifically for the death of their mother. And quite incredibly, they accept it. They accept the apology. He dies of TB, which is a common theme amongst the assassins. Grabež as well, 20 years in prison is his sentence, dies of TB in 1916. Vaso Kubrilovic, released in 1919, like Popovic, lives and dies in 1990. So he's well and truly sees the outcome of the First World War. Mehmed Basic, the man who for lack of a better word, choked on the way in, he actually is captured and is held for a while and is about to be put on trial. Escapes twice and eventually is killed by Croatian fascists in the Second World War. The only man to be hung for the job is Danilo Ilic, who's the leader of the group, hanged in, I think, February or March of 1915. And then we have one other man, which is, of course, Gavrilo Princip. He gets 20 years in prison, and he dies of TB on the 28th of April, 1918. And that date and that name, Spence, I think is interesting. I wonder, for someone who's so closely linked to the story of the Great War, who probably only ever learned of what was going on through whispered words through his prison cell bars of what was happening on the Western Front and elsewhere. I wonder how he must have felt knowing that he was involved in the spark that lit that powder keg. What do you make of it?
Well, from what I've read, he's unrepentant. He basically goes to his death, and despite knowing the carnage that his actions have caused, the tragedy that it has caused, the millions who've perished because of it, Princip is relatively unrepentant. He's very close to being executed, of course. He's 19 years and 10 months old, and he just avoids the death sentence. So, as you say, Dan, can only be sentenced to death if you're 20 years in Austro-Hungary. So he's sentenced to 20 years in jail, but his conditions are appalling, and he loses his right arm to skeletal TB, which is an appalling condition. So he's denuded an arm. His health is appalling. He dies in prison on the 28th of April, 1918. There's a persistent rumor that he carved in the wall of his cell, "A that ghosts will walk through Vienna and roam the court, frightening the gentlemen. Whether that's true or an apocryphal story, not entirely clear, probably apocryphal, but it does, I think, reflect Princeps' attitude, that he's pretty unrepentant, that he doesn't really sort of see any reason to regret what he's done. If he'd lived perhaps through all this and had been released at the end of the war and had lived long enough to reflect on it, maybe it'd have changed. But certainly his time in prison does nothing to dissuade him of the justness of his cause. And it's interesting that Princeps' grave is in Sarajevo now, and there's a chapel sort of dedicated to him and the assassins, which was badly damaged during the Yugoslav civil war. And the memory of Princeps is divisive to this day in that region. Serbian nationalists tend to revere Princeps as something of a patriot. Bosnians and Croats may see them as terrorists or anarchists, agents of chaos. It's a complex history. And if you're interested in how Princeps is seen today and how this reflects on modern politics in the region, I recommend a book by Tim Butcher, who is a British journalist who actually was a journalist during the Yugoslav Civil War and then was motivated to go back to this region in the centenary of the First World War and try and trace Princeps' journey, his life journey. And he wrote a book, Tim Butcher, called The Trigger, which I think is really interesting about Princeps' life, the world he lived in, and also what he means today, because his legacy, his memory is very much, to use a very inelegant phrase, but a modern phrase, it's very much contested. I might say it's very controversial to this day, because this one man sparked a war. And you cannot deny this. If this assassination does not take place in this time, in these circumstances, the First World War may have broken out in a few years' time. There are certainly historians who argue that, but it may not. What we do know is his actions, those two shots he fired, would be fatal for European peace. And just before we sort of go on to do this, I have to just share a little story about what happens to Apis and the Black Hand Gang, because, of course, Serbia is invaded, it gets conquered by 1915. The Serbian army is evacuated by the Allies, and the remains of the Serbian army then serves at the Salonika front. And in 1917, in quite a dramatic turn, the Serbian government in exile turns on the Black Hand ferociously, and Apis and several other prominent members of the Black Hand are arrested. They're actually accused of plotting against Prince Regent Alexander, who's the Serbian royal. The charges are a little bit trumped up, it has to be said, and Apis and a number of his conspirators are executed in 1917. It's a political purge, really. The motivations behind it, partially it's to try and reduce the degree of military interference in state affairs. It's also because the Allies themselves, Britain and France, Italy and so forth, they're a bit concerned about the level of influence that the Black Hand seems to have. So he actually, the man who in some ways was the mastermind of this assassination, dies before Princeps himself, which is quite an interesting footnote to this whole story. So it's a fascinating story. It's a tragic story. It's a story, as you say, a comedy of errors, although there's nothing to laugh about given what it leads to. And yet it's just endlessly fascinating to revisit, because I can't think of too many more single instances in the First World War with more what ifs. What if the route had been different? What if the driver had not tried to carry out a slow and laborious turn? And all these things. What if Archduke Ferdinand had simply not visited Sarajevo? We'd be looking at such a different history.
Yeah, amazing. A fascinating period to explore. Actually, for those of you that want to get a little bit more of a visual appreciation of the exact route and kind of how the story played out, do please check out Battle Guide's YouTube channel, because we've recently done a video which explores the route and the specifics of that day. So we'll share that in the link below. There's plenty more to explore. And, Spencer, I'm glad for one that we've covered this story. I think it's one that we've been overdue and maybe should have done a long way back just to set the scene. But of course, there's no doubt that it's inextricably linked with the greater story of the First World War and, of course, the story of the Western Front. But that brings us to the end of today's episode. Huge thank you to everybody that's come along and joined us. I, for one, have found it really interesting. Thanks as always, Spence, and we'll see you all next time. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Hi, gang. That's me kicking everything over.
Yeah,
I think the camera's just gone wonky there.
The camera's gone off as well. Yeah. Oh, nice.
It's always good. Doing well here. The number 3 podcast in Britain, continuing its reputation for excellence.
Mate, worldwide, I think.
Worldwide, yep.
Top 5 worldwide.
Totally independent, totally free, kicking cameras and knocking microphone stands. So, well, go. Okay,